They don't panic when you leave the room. They panic later, when the room stays quiet. At first, nothing seems different. You speak less. You explain less. You stop adjusting your tone, your timing, your emotions to keep things smooth. And because your presence used to be predictable, the absence doesn't register immediately. People assume you're tired, busy, in a phase. They expect you to return the form. But then something shifts. Conversations don't land the same. Emotional weight has nowhere to go. A familiar sense of being supported, without asking, disappears. And slowly, discomfort surfaces. Not because you're gone, but because what you provided unconsciously is no longer available. This is where most people misunderstand what's happening. They think they're missing you. They're not. They're reacting to the loss of access. Access to your attention. Access to your emotional regulation. Access to the version of you they absorbed tension so they didn't have to. According to Carl Jung, much of human connection is built on unconscious roles. When someone quietly fulfills a psychological function for others, grounding them, validating them, stabilizing them, that function becomes invisible until it's gone. And when it disappears, the psyche doesn't respond with clarity. It responds with anxiety. That's why reactions feel confusing. Mixed signals, sudden interest, irritation masked as concern, control disguised as care. What you're seeing isn't love waking up. It's dependency being exposed. This video isn't about revenge. It isn't about making anyone regret losing you. It's about understanding why withdrawal destabilizes certain people, and why your silence has more impact than any explanation ever could. Because the moment you stop being accessible by default, power quietly reorganizes. And not everyone can handle that. If this already feels uncomfortably familiar, stay with this. Not to fix anyone else, but to understand what changed in you. Quiet power begins with awareness. When you were always available, no one called it access. They called it closeness, familiarity, trust. But psychologically, something else was happening beneath the surface. You were not just present. You were regulating the emotional environment. You were absorbing tension before it surfaced. You were anticipating needs before they were expressed. And because this happened quietly, it was never acknowledged as labor. In Jungian terms, you occupied an unconscious role. According to Carl Jung, the psyche organizes relationships around functions long before it recognizes individuals. When someone consistently performs a stabilizing function, the psyche stops seeing them as a separate will. They become part of the internal system, like gravity, necessary but unnoticed. This is why access feels natural at first. There is no demand, no force. You offer presence, and people adjust around it. They relax more easily. They disclose more freely. They rely without realizing they are relying. And because you do not resist, because you do not charge a cost, the role deepens. Over time, access becomes assumed. You respond quickly. You listen fully. You soften conflict. You stay emotionally open, even when you are tired. None of this is asked directly. That is what makes it powerful. The unconscious prefers what it does not have to request. When something is always available, the psyche treats it as infrastructure, not gift. This is the first illusion. People believe they value you because they are close to you. In reality, they value what your presence allows them to avoid feeling. Anxiety, uncertainty, responsibility for their own emotional state. You become the place where discomfort goes to dissolve. And because you are empathic, you mistake this for connection. You believe closeness means mutuality. You believe availability is generosity. You believe being needed is being valued. Quietly, the dynamic forms. You give regulation. They experience relief, but relief is not reciprocity. The psyche does not bond to effort. It bonds to effect. This is why access goes unnoticed. The person benefiting does not feel the work. They feel the result: calm, stability, validation. And because the result feels internal, they assume it originates from within themselves. You are simply nearby. This is also why appreciation fades. Not because they care less, but because the function has been absorbed. Like a background process, your contribution becomes part of the normal state, and the normal state is invisible. At this stage, no one is using you intentionally. There is no villain. There is only unconscious adaptation. Human beings adjust to what is consistently present. They lean where there is no resistance. They rest where there is support. And they stop noticing the surface holding them up. The problem is not that you are empathic. The problem is that empathy without containment erases contrast. Without contrast, value disappears. Contrast is what makes absence noticeable. As long as you are accessible, there is no signal to register your contribution. The system stabilizes around you. And systems resist change, not out of cruelty, but survival. When a stabilizing element withdraws, the system experiences threat. This is why the moment you pull back feels disproportionate. You speak less. You stop explaining. You delay responses. These are minor adjustments, but the reaction can feel intense. Confusion, frustration, sudden concern, subtle pressure to return. It feels personal. It isn't. What is reacting is not their conscious mind, but the structure that depended on your availability. In Jungian psychology, this is the collapse of projection. Others projected stability, understanding, and emotional processing onto you. When you withdraw, those qualities do not disappear. They fall back onto the person who avoided them. This creates discomfort, and discomfort demands explanation. So the mind searches for reasons. They ask what changed. They wonder if you are upset. They assume something is wrong, not because they lost you, but because they lost access to the function you provided. This is why explanations do not help. Explaining invites negotiation. Negotiation restores access, and the psyche relaxes again without learning. Quiet power begins when you recognize this pattern without resentment. You see that being constantly available trained others to unconsciously rely on you. You see that withdrawal feels threatening because it disrupts equilibrium. And you understand that their reaction is not proof you did something wrong. It is proof that access mattered more than either of you realized. This realization is uncomfortable because it reframes closeness. It shows you that some bonds were maintained by what you provided, not who you were. That does not mean affection was false. It means it was incomplete. True connection survives boundaries. Dependency does not. When access disappears, real connection either adapts or dissolves. The psyche must choose between growth and control. Some people grow. They self-regulate. They meet you at a new level. Others attempt to restore the old dynamic. Not consciously, automatically. This is where many people falter. They misinterpret pressure as care. They mistake intensity for importance. They reopen access to relieve the tension. And the system stabilizes again, unchanged. Quiet power refuses this reflex. You do not withdraw to punish. You withdraw to observe. You watch how people respond when the emotional infrastructure is removed. You see who adjusts and who resists, who respects silence and who demands access. This observation is not judgment, it is information. And information is power. When you understand that access shaped the relationship, you stop personalizing reactions. You stop explaining yourself into exhaustion. You stop returning prematurely. You allow the system to reveal its nature. Because the truth is simple. If your absence creates panic, it was not because you were loved deeply. It was because you were essential quietly. And essentials are only noticed when they are gone. That is where the story begins. The moment you withdraw, something subtle fractures. Not externally at first, but internally, within the psychological structure of the other person. The loss does not register as absence. It registers as instability, a quiet disorientation, a feeling that something familiar is no longer holding. This is because your presence was not just relational, it was regulatory. In many dynamics, especially those involving empaths, one person unconsciously becomes the emotional stabilizer. They notice shifts in mood. They smooth transitions. They absorb tension before it escalates. They hold space so others don't have to hold themselves. Over time, this function becomes outsourced. When you withdraw, the outsourced function returns to its owner, and that return is uncomfortable. The first reaction is rarely insight. It is irritation, confusion, restlessness. The psyche does not say, "I depended on them." It says, "Something is wrong." And because the discomfort feels sudden, the mind looks outward for a cause. You become that cause. This is why withdrawal often triggers strange behavior. Sudden emotional distance followed by sudden closeness. Passive concern mixed with subtle control. Questions that sound caring but feel invasive. None of this is calculated. It is compensatory. The psyche is trying to restore equilibrium. According to Carl Jung, when an unconscious support collapses, the shadow activates. A shadow is not evil. It is what the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. In this case, dependency, entitlement, fear of self-regulation. When you were present, these qualities stayed hidden. You carried the emotional weight, so the other person never had to confront it. When you step back, that weight drops inward, and the shadow reacts defensively. This is where control attempts begin. Not overt domination, but subtle testing. Emotional bids. Guilt disguised as concern. Nostalgia used as leverage. The past is referenced, not to reconnect, but to reactivate the old pattern. You used to. You've changed. I don't recognize you. These phrases are not observations. They are strategies. Not conscious ones, but instinctive ones. The psyche is attempting to re-establish access without confronting its own imbalance. If you respond by explaining, reassuring, or re-engaging fully, the system stabilizes again. The discomfort fades, and nothing changes. This is why silence feels so threatening to certain people. Silence offers no feedback, no emotional data, no confirmation. Without response, the psyche cannot recalibrate externally. It is forced inward, and many people have never learned to go there. Withdrawal exposes asymmetry. It reveals who benefited more from the dynamic. In balanced relationships, withdrawal is noticed, but respected. Space is given. Adjustment occurs. In imbalanced ones, withdrawal is resisted. Access is demanded. Emotional pressure increases. This is the fracture point. You begin to see the relationship clearly, not through words, but through reactions. Who honors your autonomy? Who treats it as abandonment? Who adapts? Who panics? This information is unsettling because it contradicts the story you told yourself. You believed closeness was mutual. You believed emotional labor was shared. But now you see that much of what held the connection together came from you, not your personality, your function. The other person may genuinely feel distressed. That distress is real, but it is not proof of love. It is proof of dysregulation. The loss of an external stabilizer always feels like loss of control. This is where many empaths feel guilt. They sense the discomfort they caused. They feel responsible for restoring calm. They mistake dysregulation for harm, and they step back into the role. Quiet power resists this impulse. You allow the discomfort to exist, not to punish, but to reveal. You understand that growth only happens when the psyche confronts what it avoided. And by withdrawing, you are no longer preventing that confrontation. This does not mean you become cold. It means you become neutral. Neutrality is powerful because it removes emotional hooks. It does not reward pressure. It does not escalate conflict. It simply does not engage with manipulation. At this stage, the other person faces a choice. They can develop internal regulation, or they can attempt to regain control externally. Some choose growth. Others double down on tactics. This is when the dynamic either transforms or ends. The empath often feels this as loneliness. The sudden quiet, the absence of engagement, the sense that something once warm has gone still. This is not failure. It is transition. You are no longer filling space that was never yours to hold alone. Withdrawal reveals the true cost of access. You see how much energy was required to maintain harmony, how much self-suppression was involved, how often you ignored your own signals to preserve the dynamic. This awareness is irreversible. You can no longer unsee the pattern. You recognize when someone approaches you for relief rather than connection. You sense when attention is transactional. You notice when interest increases only after you pull away. And because you see it, you stop feeding it. This is why some people say, "You've changed," with discomfort rather than curiosity. They are not reacting to who you've become. They are reacting to what they can no longer extract. Withdrawal breaks illusions. It exposes dependence. It destabilizes unconscious contracts, and it forces clarity where there was comfort. This is not cruelty. It is truth emerging. When you stop regulating others, they are invited to regulate themselves. Some will accept the invitation. Others will reject it. Either way, the relationship cannot return to its previous form. And that is the point. What breaks is not connection. What breaks is unconscious access. And once broken, it cannot be restored without mutual awareness. That is where real power begins. There is a moment that arrives quietly, often unnoticed at first, when the other person understands something fundamental has shifted. It is not when you stop replying quickly. It is not when you say no. It is not even when you create distance. It is when they sense that none of their usual strategies are working anymore. This moment is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It appears as a subtle internal panic, a loss of orientation. The familiar levers no longer move anything. The emotional cues they once relied on produce no response. The dynamic they understood intuitively no longer follows its old rules. This is when control dissolves. Control, in this context, was never about dominance. It was about predictability. They knew how you would respond. They knew how to bring you closer, how to trigger reassurance, how to restore emotional flow. They did not think of this as manipulation. It felt natural because the pattern had always worked. When it stops working, the psyche scrambles. At first, there is denial. They assume it is temporary. They wait for you to return to baseline. They give you space, not out of respect, but expectation. Silence is tolerated briefly, because silence has always ended before. But when silence holds, unease grows. This is where escalation begins, not aggressively, but subtly. More messages, more emotional intensity, concern framed as care, confusion framed as curiosity. The goal is not connection. The goal is restoration of access. If this fails, frustration surfaces. The tone shifts. What was once gentle becomes sharp. What was once patient becomes impatient. You may sense irritation where warmth used to be. This is not anger at you. It is anger at the loss of influence. The psyche experiences this as a threat to stability. When you no longer respond as expected, the internal narrative fractures. They can no longer predict the emotional environment. And unpredictability is deeply unsettling, especially for those who relied on you to regulate discomfort. They never learned to hold themselves. This is where the illusion of mutual dependence collapses. They realize, often unconsciously, that the balance was never equal. that they leaned more than they supported, that they took more than they gave. And instead of integrating this awareness, many attempt reverse it. Control attempts become clearer now. They may test boundaries openly, push for explanations, frame your withdrawal as hurtful or unfair. They may accuse you of changing, becoming distant, becoming selfish. These accusations are not about morality. They are about loss of leverage. When explanation fails, guilt is introduced. Guilt is powerful because it targets empathy. It reminds you of your old role. It appeals to who you used to be. It says, without words, that you are responsible for their emotional state, that your withdrawal is causing harm. This is the final mechanism of control. If guilt works, the system resets. You step back in, you soften, you regulate again, and the moment passes without transformation. If guilt does not work, something else happens. They feel exposed. Without access to you, their own emotional patterns become visible. Anxiety rises without an outlet. Irritation has nowhere to go. Insecurity surfaces without reassurance. They are left with themselves. This is the point of no return. Some people respond to this by turning inward. They reflect, they adapt, they begin regulating their own emotions. These relationships can evolve. They become more balanced, more conscious. Others respond by externalizing blame. They label you cold, detached, changed, difficult. They rewrite the story so they are not required to change themselves. In their narrative, you are the problem, not because you withdrew, but because withdrawal removed their comfort. Quiet power does not argue with these narratives. You let them exist without correction. You understand that someone who cannot tolerate loss of access will also resist accountability. And accountability is required for genuine connection. At this stage, your calm becomes unsettling. You are no longer reactive. You do not defend. You do not justify. You do not explain your boundaries into existence. You simply maintain them. This is when they realize control is gone, not because you asserted power, but because you stopped offering it away. Your silence is not passive. It is deliberate. It signals that you are no longer participating in unconscious contracts. That access now requires mutual respect. That emotional labor is no longer automatic. This realization can feel like loss to them, and in a way, it is. They lost the version of you that made their inner world easier to manage. They lost a buffer. They lost a regulator. But what they did not lose was you. They lost access. This distinction matters, because access can be revoked without hatred, without anger, without explanation. It is not punishment. It is self-preservation. This is also where your internal shift completes. You stop monitoring their reactions. You stop waiting for understanding. You stop hoping they will see things your way. You accept that clarity does not always arrive for both people at the same time. You feel lighter now, not because nothing matters, but because you are no longer carrying what was never yours to begin with. Your energy consolidates. You notice how quiet feels different now, not empty, stable. You notice how your nervous system settles, how decisions become cleaner, how relationships feel less draining. This is not emotional shutdown. It is emotional ownership. You still feel deeply, but you feel for yourself first. You honor your limits. You trust your signals. You choose where your empathy goes. And because of this, those who interact with you sense something different. They approach more carefully. They speak more honestly. Or they drift away entirely. Both outcomes are alignment. The loss of control on their side is the restoration of autonomy on yours. You are no longer accessible by default. You are present by choice. And that is the moment the dynamic truly ends. Not with confrontation, with containment. What emerges after withdrawal is not emptiness. It is structure. The quiet after access ends is often mistaken for loss, but psychologically, it is consolidation. Energy that once flowed outward without limit begins to gather. Attention that was scattered returns home. And with that return, something unfamiliar forms. Authority. Authority is not dominance. It does not announce itself. It does not need agreement. It is the internal permission to exist without constant exchange. For the first time, your presence is not shaped by response. It is shaped by alignment. This is where the final misunderstanding falls away. People believe that when you withdraw, you are waiting. Waiting to be noticed. Waiting to be missed. Waiting for someone to understand. But the truth is simpler and far more unsettling. You are no longer orienting yourself around external feedback at all. According to Carl Jung, individuation begins when the psyche stops organizing itself around adaptation and starts organizing itself around integration. This is the phase you have entered. Not growth toward others, but coherence within yourself. The absence of access does something powerful. It removes the need to perform. Without an audience to regulate, your nervous system recalibrates. You sleep differently, think differently, respond differently. Not because you are trying to change, but because you are no longer compensating. This is the rise no one sees. Externally, little appears to happen. There is no announcement, no victory, no closure conversation. But internally, your decisions shift. You stop chasing clarity from people who benefited from confusion. You stop seeking reassurance from dynamics that required self-erasure. You stop measuring your worth by how useful you are to others. This is not emotional detachment. It is emotional precision. You feel more now, not less. But your feelings are no longer scattered across relationships that cannot hold them. They are rooted, directed, chosen. What changes most is timing. You no longer respond immediately, not as a tactic, but because urgency is gone. You no longer rush to explain yourself, because explanation no longer secures safety. You no longer negotiate your boundaries, because they are not requests, they are facts. This is authority. Others sense it without words. They feel it in the pause, in the lack of overcompensation, in the calm refusal to be pulled into old roles. Some respect it instantly. Others resist it deeply. Resistance is revealing. Those who relied on your access feel unsettled. They cannot locate you in the old map. Their strategies fail. Their expectations collapse. They may attempt one last reach, one last narrative, one last emotional bid. Not to reconnect, but to reestablish familiarity. You do not engage, not because you are cold, but because engagement would undo the integration you have achieved. This is where the final separation occurs. Not externally, but internally. You release the need to be understood by those who required you to stay the same. You accept that some people only feel safe when you are available in predictable ways, and you allow them to feel unsafe without trying to fix it. This is compassion without self-sacrifice. The rise is subtle. It shows up as discernment, as selectivity, as the ability to walk away without rehearsing reasons. You no longer fear being misinterpreted because you are no longer interpreting yourself through others. You begin to choose environments that respect rhythm over intensity. You choose relationships that offer reciprocity over reliance. You choose silence over explanation when silence is cleaner. This changes everything. Opportunities align differently. Not louder, but truer. People approach you differently, with more respect or not at all. Both outcomes are clarity. You are no longer drawn into dynamics by empathy alone. You assess energy before you invest it. This is not hardness. It is maturity. The empath's sensitivity, once diffuse, has become concentrated. It is no longer an open channel. It is a lens. When you care now, it is deliberate. When you give, it is bounded. When you connect, it is mutual. This makes your presence rare, and rarity commands respect without demand. You may still feel echoes of the old pull, moments where guilt surfaces, where you wonder if you should check in, soften, reopen. These moments pass because your body remembers the cost, and your body no longer negotiates with memory. You trust yourself now. This trust is quiet, but it is unshakable. It does not depend on validation. It does not collapse under misunderstanding. It holds steady even when others rewrite the story to protect themselves. You let them. Their narrative no longer defines you. What remains is something grounded, calm, unavailable for misuse. You are no longer the emotional infrastructure of someone else's life. You are the architect of your own. This is the true consequence of ending access. Not abandonment, not revenge, not disappearance. Integration. The world does not see this as a comeback. There is no applause for containment, no recognition for self-respect, but you feel it in the way your life simplifies, in the way your energy returns, in the way peace replaces performance. You did not rise above anyone. You rose into yourself, and from that place, access is no longer assumed. It is earned. If this didn't feel like motivation, that's intentional. Real shifts don't arrive loudly. They arrive as relief. You don't need to announce your distance. You don't need to correct the story others tell. You don't need to be understood by people who only knew you through access. If this helped you recognize where your energy belongs, stay here. This channel isn't about becoming colder. It's about becoming unavailable for unconscious use, quietly.